friends and family, and Your Excellency, my mother, and thank you all for turning up for this talk called Apokalips, named after a great M. Nasir song of the 1990s. That featured, among other things, is quite radical video of him stepping over dead bodies, people in kain kafan, which I think may not necessarily have been very representative of the 90s when they began, but was definitely kind of representative of the 90s by the time the decade ended, not just in Malaysia, but in many parts of the world. Kuala Lumpur is my city, and I was born here, I was raised here, I grew up here, to parents who are not from this city. And by the 1990s, you essentially had a native Kuala Lumpurian population that was coming into maturity and beginning life in the workforce. While Kuala Lumpur, of course, had a native population, but the great variety of people who came and settled in Kuala Lumpur were like my parents from Perak or from Johor, from Kedah. We today live in a Kuala Lumpur that has still kind of not escaped the 90s. I don't know if anyone has Manila as one of their favorite cities in the world. I claim Manila as one of my favorite cities in the world outside of Kuala Lumpur. But the moment you land in Manila, you never escape the 1980s, because President Marcos continues to haunt every aspect of the Manila vicinity. And today, as we look in the news in Kuala Lumpur and we look at that great triumvirate battle still going on between Prime Minister number 1, his deputy number 2, and his great lieutenant, who has just passed away, number 3, we realize that so many of these contradictions and paradoxes and inner battles and inner animosities have still not gone. In sociological, literary, and historical terms, we call this the heavy decade. And I would encourage every single one of you really to, if you haven't already, people are a lot more interested in what's going on behind me than me. So we want to maybe just kind of hold the loops for a while, and I may glance and actually explain some of what is going on at the back. And I say paradoxes, and I say contradictions, and I say battles that come out because we essentially are a society that is born out of political fratricide. Somewhere along the way, we were all brothers, and we were all kin. And of course, the breakdown of kinship results in a kind of Cain and Abel situation, and there are no hatreds, of course, like the hatreds between brothers. So try and make a special trip to see Bang Bang Boom, Boom Boom Bang, sorry, Bang Bang Boom, Boom Boom Bang, Boom Boom Bang. I'm 55, please forgive me. It's really wonderfully curated, and as I went through the exhibition, I was just overwhelmed by so many memories. And really how significant that decade was in all kinds of sociological, political, and the whole question of nationhood and how it became so diversified. What made the 90s so radical, I think, particularly in Kuala Lumpur, was the fact that I think in the 90s the nation died. Throughout much of the 50s and 60s, Malaya and then Malaysia was devoted to this notion of nation building following independence in 1957. And Malaysia's independence, of course, is very interesting because, and I may get into a lot of, there might be quite a lot of fractiousness because I carry with me my father's attitude about what our independence was, considering that Malaya was never colonized. In a de facto kind of way. De jure, different. but in the legal terms, we were never colonized, which is why Malaysia was always known as a protectorate. And it was never British rule that was used here. The term that was used was British administration. And so in 1957, and this is written about very lucidly and I think very movingly by my father in an essay that I can't recall what the essay was, but essentially what independence meant. And independence for Malaya was not freedom from colonial rule, but a transference of British administration to local administration. And in fact, the sovereignty of our people was not gained from the British, but was gained from the transfer of sovereignty to from the Malay rulers to the people. That was the birth of our democracy. And the 1950s and 1960s were very much devoted, especially in Kuala Lumpur, which was started to emerge as an administrative city in the deeper sense of the word, was devoted towards nation building, until nation building failed us in 1969, May 13th, the year of my birth. 6 months and 1 day after May 13th, I was born. So my mother was carrying me on that event, and she herself got caught up in some melee once in Jalan Tunku Abdul Rahman. May 13th went on for quite a while before it actually subdued. And then the 70s right into the early 80s were devoted towards social reconstruction with the new economic policy and various policies to redress racial and social imbalances in our society. The real revolution, of course, happened in 1982. 1981, with the coming of Dr. Mahathir Mohamad as our fourth Prime Minister. And I will talk quite a lot about him later, not in terms of a eulogy or a criticism, but really to try and place him, who is still bedeviling us in the center of our consciousness, whether we like him or loathe him. But the 80s were essentially when Kuala Lumpur emerged and was at the forefront of Mahathir's futuristic vision. If you go up to boom, boom, bang, not bang, bang, boom, 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 bang, you will see a Macintosh computer. Dr. Mahathir's second official photograph, his first official photograph is a very well-known one now, taken by Bernama, where he's walking out of his office, and behind him is his motto, Bersih, Cekap, Amanah. Right? That was the first official Mahathir portrait photograph. Not official, but social, meant to reach out to the people. The second one was of him in his new office, and he's playing on a Macintosh. And it's significant, of course, because he talks about Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur way back then, 1981, as a futuristic city, a city that is devoted towards science, technology, and the pursuit of developing Malaysia as a first world nation. And that's the Macintosh, which belongs to Ismail Zain, is upstairs. And it's remarkable how heavy it looks compared to what we carry now. The 1990s was when this futuristic notion of Malaysia really came into being with the pronouncement of something, the National Development Plan, or otherwise known to us as Wawasan 2020, Vision 2020, which basically was to proclaim Malaysia's pursuit towards first industrialized nation, first world nation, the consolidation of our technocratic society, and along with that, various social experiments. And Malaysia has been very unique in terms of how much of an experiment we are. And sometimes quite frightening Freudian terms are used, like social reconstruction, mental revolution, which was a policy really to enhance all this very much put into in terms of policy and then introduced into the administration. So we're very much a society, and we're very much a city then, Kuala Lumpur, that's devoted to all these kind of catchphrases that are then emblazoned everywhere by perhaps the worst local authority in the world, the Dewan Bandaraya Kuala Lumpur, emblazoned everywhere, very loud but with very little meaning. But what really signaled futuristic Kuala Lumpur? A real severance of the Kuala Lumpur of the 90s to anything that came before. And many people might not remember this, but when it did emerge, it was a major point of contention. Something for which Dr. Mahathir was challenged right at the peak of his career in 1995, and from which, I'm glad to say, as a result of so much social pressure, he took a step back. This was the plan to demolish Stadium Merdeka in 1995-1996, and to replace Stadium Merdeka with essentially entertainment and commercial complex. That received a lot of backlash and a lot of anger, really. And I had a very interesting incident at that time. Funnily, both my brother and I became journalists in the 1990s. I was a print journalist. My brother was a broadcast journalist who used to read the news kind of every day. At a time when the news was quite a fixation because of the rapid change of development every single day. Not just commercially, not just economically, but also politically. So Ruben was the face of the main 7:30 TV3 news. And I remember the first time he had to report on site somewhere near the toll, I think. Sorry? And he froze, yes. He became quite a master after that. But it was the plans to demolish Stadium Merdeka and to replace it with essentially what is today Merdeka 118. The plan was already then. But there was a huge outcry. And one of the people who made the most, I suppose, cogent and intellectual arguments was my father, the national historian, who was asked what he thought about. For all that my father has gained a reputation of being a bit of a Mahathirist, when push came to shove, he I think, encapsulated the argument. And I remember his quote very carefully. He said, "The problem with Malaysia is we have a future, but we have no past. And that is like driving with no rear view mirror, while a 20-ton truck is basically rushing towards you." Dr. Mahathir wasn't very pleased with this statement, and not very pleased with the overall reaction of people. I was dispatched to basically get a comment from him about the bad reaction. And I remember this very clearly. It was a TNB dinner, I think. I had to wait for him, and he emerged from the dinner looking quite grumpy. Dr. Mahathir had this, kind of very intimidating, grumpy look when he wanted to have it. And I approached him and I said, Datuk Sri, that time Datuk Sri belum tun, ya. Datuk Sri, what are your thoughts about, the negative response to your plans for Stadium Merdeka? And he gave a very standard answer about how Malaysia needs to look in the future, and this is where the world is going, and we need to be technologically advanced. And I asked him a question. I said, what about history? And this is Mahathirism for you, yeah? His quote is amazing. "History, don't be sentimental," right, was his statement. And then he walked past me and he looked at me and he said, "Your father put you up to this, did he?" Yeah, and then he walked off. Right? Very dramatic. And in terms of hindsight, at that time, of course, I was kind of, my knees were knocking lah, because you never knew. But let me also, this is an aside, say that for all that is made about Mahathir's interjections in a lot of news and apparently commands that were coming from the Prime Minister's office, I think as working journalists on the ground, we always had this motto, which was, any story is possible, for as long as you know what angle to enter it from. Yeah, and a period of media liberalization actually did take place. In 1992, I joined the Star, and very soon after developed an interest in Islamic politics, particularly in Kelantan, and the interest was very diverse. It took into account a lot of interest in culture, in ritual, in tradition, but also in politics, in Parti Islam in particular. And very soon I began writing pretty extensive pieces. Those days you had a tabloid size, full page, on looking at past machinations. I remember in 1995 being dispatched to cover the elections and writing everyday dispatches, not on Kelantan politics, but specifically on Parti Islam, in particular on the appeal of its chief minister then, Tuan Guru Aziz Nikmat. So it was a quite complicated and complex period with, I think, lots of liberalization, bits of pushback now and again, but it was a very tentative period because I think the leadership also at that period of time realized we were at the center pin of a world in which these changes were taking place and were and you know, questions from the ground were inevitable. So it really was a matter not of shutting out things, but of trying to manage things almost most of the time. And as I said, the 90s was also the period of, I think, the end of nation. And what I mean by the end of nation is that people developed independent and individual patriotisms. It was the coming of age, for example, of civil society organizations. I remember going for I have a very funny, but very negative story about sisters in Islam. And Zaina, I think, has just walked in. And myself. Of sometimes missing appointments because I enjoyed a lot of drink. And I happened to do that to a Sisters in Islam assignment. And Zaya, of course, perhaps one of the scariest people in the world, called me the next day and just gave me such a bollocking. It was but so we had that kind of devolution, I think, from the prominent agendas that had dominated Malaysia. So futuristic Kuala Lumpur was the agenda, but there was a lot of discussion about it. And when I first joined the press in 1992, you spent 3 months as a cub reporter, and I remember running around in Parliament. I remember Sami Velu almost wanting to hit my mentor, Bharathan, for writing some article on the MIC. So it was all very, very exciting, and I have very, very fond memories of many ministers. Syed Hamid Alba, who was the Minister of Law at that time. I remember us calling him Guru Besar, because he had just a very stern, very kind of dignified way. The one minister I think who was quite difficult was our present Prime Minister, who as Deputy Prime Minister was rather prickly and vain. Unlike our Prime Minister, whom we all really kind of adored. Although Dr. Mahathir had kind of strange dislikes. He disliked reporters smoking. He disliked reporters who wore earrings. And he really disliked long hair. So I remember covering him in Kelantan in 1995 elections, and he arrived. And Dr. Mahathir was always in a foul mood when he went to Kelantan. And so he would keep it as his last stop. So there he is, he arrives. And I had a photographer whose name is Saha. I still remember him very fondly. And Saha had hair down to here, to his waist. And Dr. M came into the Kelantan UMNO building, which today is in Kota Baru, totally decrepit, falling to bits. But at that time, it was swanky. And very extraordinary in Kelantan because you have a very swanky, very modern UMNO building with nobody in it. But this occasion came, and Saha had to rush up front to get a good shot of Dr. Mahathir, which he did, and Dr. Mahathir passed by and looked at Saha and said, "Ini perempuan ke laki?" Is this a man or a woman? Okay. We thought nothing of it, and then we went back, and then we were going to cover him again in the evening. And when I met Saha again at 6 p.m. downstairs at the lobby of the Pradana Hotel, his hair had been cut. So PMO's office. PMO's office, as far as I know, never gave an instruction about what headline to lead, and they maybe made suggestions and discussions, but there was definitely a directive about a person's hair. But 1992, so I joined as a cub reporter, and I was sent to Parliament, and then later on I got a beat. Journalists don't have those beats anymore, which is a shame. You had people on the labor beat, you had people on the education beat. Now it's kind of a free-for-all. And I had culture. Culture until an emergency came up. For me, that emergency was Highland Towers. In 1992, the collapse of Highland Towers, which, if we believed in seers and oracles and astrologers, might have been an indication of what would come by the end of the 1990s. Basically, one of the most sophisticated apartment blocks, everybody wanted to live in Highland Towers, basically come crashing down. Even as, you know, in some instances, people were driving out to work and then look at the rear mirror and the whole thing came down. So much of the story of Kuala Lumpur, I suppose, isn't that. Right? Rapacious development, a lack of proper methods, local authority rot, all became big things in the 1990s. But it was also a very, very prominent time, very, very also meaningful for me to be born in this time. Anyone talking about astrology, anyone born with the number 9, 69, 59, 79, you're always on the cusp of great change. And of course the 90s, 1999 was the fin de siècle, the last before the next millennium. And 9, of course, for Hindus, is the number of the mother goddess. So Shakti, the outflow of Shakti or energy, you know, and the cleaning out of a particular decade, entering a new one. I went to university. I was born in 69. I went to university in 1989. It was a very, very tumultuous period. And if we believe in the fin de siècle and we believe in Shakti changes in astrology, I did my A-levels in November of 1988, and I had about 8 months basically to get a sense of what university meant, what the world was like. And after a lot of partying between time in December and January, we had our first shock of 1989, which was the death sentence on a writer called Salman Rushdie on February 14th. And all of a sudden what happened was Islam, which had always kind of been murmuring in the world news, became very, very dominant. The attempt to understand what Islam as a political tool began to peak at that period of time following this. By June, we had Tiananmen Square. And all that was said about China seemed to implode with the events of Tiananmen Square. I went to university in October of 1989, and I had signed up to do a philosophy course. And I arrived in university to discover that my department had been shut down. Because Thatcherism, which had dominated the economic model of that time, suddenly pronounced that universities had to be profitable. And the last thing that was profitable, of course, was bloody philosophy department, where 3 students would sit there contemplating the question, who am I? So I arrived there to discover I was departmentless. And after mulling, and you know, philosophy students, you know, bugger pays £5,000 or whatever it is at that time. It's hardly anything, it's not medical fees. So what do we do with him? We just shove him around departments, right, and see what interests him. So I went for a whole series of everything from politics to sociology to a bit of economics, and ended up in the religious studies department, where I opted to do Islamic thought and Islamic philosophy. And what inspired that was basically the realization that Islam would become the next great force in world politics over the next decade. And so I'd better get a foot in, not just in the world, but also in my country. So I'd better get a foot in. And I did that, and it turned out to be just about the best decision I've ever made in my life. And after 2 months in the UK, I was also thrust into what I might possibly do for a living, because something remarkable happened in November of 1989. In November in 1989, the Hungarian authorities decided that Hungarians can now cross the border and go on holiday. By which time, at this time, a figure rose in what was the former Soviet Union, whose name was Mikhail Gorbachev, who made a visit to Kuala Lumpur in also, I think, 1988, in his trip on Southeast Asia. And Mikhail Gorbachev, of course, had basically introduced perestroika and glasnost, and more importantly, the non-interference in the independent satellite states of the Soviet Union. And so the Hungarians decided that, okay, maybe our population needs a holiday, so we're not going to stop them from crossing the border. And what happened was a mass exodus of people. I really encourage you all to read Angela Merkel's new memoirs that have just been published. Angela Merkel, of course, was a bureaucrat in the finance ministry of the DDR in those days, Democratic Republic of Germany, East Germany, otherwise known as. And she recounts the day when that pronouncement was also made, that East Germans can now visit wherever they want in the world without needing the restrictions and family relations and whatever not. And the next thing they knew, that the wall was basically barraged by people attempting to climb the wall. This was perhaps the biggest political event in my lifetime, the end of the Cold War. A couple of months ago, it was very significant. I gave a talk with, among others, Professor Jomo, and people were there, to something called the Young Entrepreneurs Grouping or something, at the Bank Negara auditorium. This is a group of mainly young Malays, under 30, very industrious, very intelligent, very bright, talking about the political future of Malaysia over the next 3 decades. And I sat in this room, and I think tensions were rising in the South China Sea. And so the moderator, who was quite a smart young man, he said he wanted to do a quick poll. And he asked the audience of about 300 people, again, mainly Malay under the age of 30. He said, if war broke out in the South China Seas between the United States and China, how many of you would support the United States? 2 hands went up. Okay, 2 hands. So, and then he said, how many of you would support China? And all of the rest of the hands went up. Remarkable because, and so when I started my conversation, I said, this is remarkable because in my lifetime, China was the 2nd country in my passport out of about 26 that you couldn't go to. Right? And none of these young people have a memory of that. Albania was the 1st, China was the 2nd, Cuba was the 3rd. Okay? Today, the only country that remains is Israel. And as you look at this group of young people, there is no memory of that, of what our place was in the Cold War, what were the sides we took, and of course, what kind of ideology shaped us as a result of that. And 98% of these students are pro-China. Young people are pro-China. And they never heard of the Cold War. Perang Dingin. Some have maybe, passing. But we don't. And this is the generation of essentially the 1990s. Born into a Kuala Lumpur, as I said, already booming, and that's another great term of the 1990s, boom and bust, that we experience, and then a lot of the rest of the world experience. So there was great euphoria, of course, when the Berlin Wall came down, the Cold War ended. I was, as I said, flung into the profession that I eventually chose, journalism, because the newspapers in the United Kingdom were something else. You couldn't afford to buy a newspaper every day, but eventually the university gave you a kind of token, so you could buy a Guardian or Independent or the Times for 1p. But what you did on the weekends was basically save your money and buy the weekend newspapers, which was a read that lasted you throughout the entire week. And I came across some amazing journalistic names: Neil Ascheson, Timothy Garton Ash, and my favorite was a Polish journalist by the name of Ryszard Kapuscinski, who wrote marvelous books, and you couldn't tell whether they were fiction or they were journalism. Bill Buford, a lot of people like that. And we came to know our own here as well. Gunawan Muhammad, who was putting up a stout defense for Tempo in Indonesia. And I came under the tutorship and guardianship of someone who was my father's very dear friend, but who took a lot of interest in things I was writing about, and I used to have a kind of session with him every Friday. His name was Abdul Samad Ismail, A. Samad Ismail, perhaps one of our best and greatest journalists, and also one of the most intrepid and enigmatic political figures, who happened to be a gun runner for the Indonesian Revolution in the 1940s and 50s. Founder of the PAP, was then expelled by Lee Kuan Yew, never allowed to enter in. So the 90s was a lot of discovering these stories. Sharat would know, and we had so many of these sessions where we brought out all these old guys. Said Zahari and the left were starting to stake a claim on Malaysia's history, and Kuala Lumpur was also dragged into that what we called a period of historical contestation as to what is legitimate history and what is not. And this led all to the consensus of what the nation was. And the 90s, of course, this exhibition is marvelous because one of the areas in which this was most done was the arts and culture. So very interesting, complicated time. And I think, one of the things we spoke about last time was how, you have time, huh? I'll just be talking because we want to have a discussion. The thing was, of course, and we spoke about this, I think, here at Ilham many years ago, about how Malaysia essentially is a very negligible nation. We are 30,000 people today, 36, 32, some. 32 million people. When we started out a nation, I think we were about 8 to 10, and then grew. This is a very negligible nation in terms of population, but we have, of course, the great advantage of geography since the time of Malacca. And I think what is very astute, foreign policy alliances, that was especially prominent during the age of Dr. Mahathir. One of my first political acts was to go to Stadium Negara in 1985 or 1986, I think, because the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization was visiting Malaysia. I was in Form 4. I didn't care very much about politics, although I was born in the maelstrom of politics of May 13th, 1969. My father was, a prominent face on television. That was as far as my politics went. And I read the news, and I think Ghazali Shafi'i visited our house, Ma'am, once. And we knew ministers, we could identify them. We had a minister of women whose name was Fatima. I can't remember Fatima what, but as a boy I couldn't, and she was rather large, and she was our neighbor, and as a boy I couldn't say, Datuk Fatima, so I said Fatty Amma. So Fatty Amma remained the name in our house for forever. She was a very nice lady. Her husband was the Attorney General, Datuk Kadir, Tan Sri Kadir. So that was far as politics went. But somewhere along the way, you kind of get caught with names. You get very fixated with Dr. Mahathir as a boy. You never decided whether you liked him or not. You were always kind of afraid of him because he was a bit stern. But all of a sudden you had people visiting, leaders of great prominence. In 1977, I remember watching the TV when we hosted the ASEAN conference. And the whole nation was fixated with Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, to whom Tun Hussein, seemed very grey. And we believed everything about the marvel and the beauty of this lady because she was just that glamorous. And so your politics was like that. But in 1985, I think, I went to hear this big rally that was held in Stadium Negara. And it had Arafat and Dr. Mahathir. And halfway through, Arafat pulled out his pistol and shot blanks. And it was very interesting because that was about the time, I think, that we imposed the death penalty on anyone carrying illegal firearms. I went back to school. I had played truant, so I was called up and I think given a suspension for about a week for illegally attending a political gathering. But by the 1990s, that had all changed. Malaysia, of course, had always been prominent in world affairs, especially in the Southeast Asian region. We had Darurat, we had emergency, we had a confrontation, we had the communist peril. But I think Mahathir foreign policy really took us to the forefront of many of the burning issues of the day. The main one being Palestine, of course, which has been a very long support. But most importantly, and something that I also took very active involvement in when I went to university, was the struggle of fight against apartheid. And of course, Dr. Mahathir and Nelson Mandela were real comrades. The first, one of the first gestures for the formal ending of apartheid was, of course, the boycott of South Africa. And that consensus was actually done in 1987 here at the Commonwealth Conference, and later passed in 1988 in Montreal by the Canadian, but started in Malaysia. And that, I think, raised the profile of Malaysia very much. Indonesia, of course, in the Southeast Asian region too. The 1990s were dominated by so much of nation states actually beginning to crumble. We saw that in Indonesia. We saw that with the struggle for East Timor. Very prominent thing. Malaysia played a role for all kinds of reasons. Apart from one, we had the APSAT conference in which Sharad was there, and all were arrested and thrown into prison for 3 nights or 4 nights, where apparently they had a really good time, telling jokes and looking after each other. But there too, Malaysia played a prominent role as an intermediary to bring Gus Mau eventually into power. And then in 1997, we played a major role through ASEAN to bring the end of the military rule in Myanmar. But ironically, we did that in 1987 by inviting Myanmar to be part of ASEAN. I covered the conference, which was in Hyatt Saujana in Subang. While waiting for the dignitaries to come, we saw there was a bit of a melee on the other side. And I turned to my friend, Wan Hamidi, some of you may know him, a very veteran journalist. And I said, "Hey brother, what's going on there?" He said, Fan Yu Teng and his gang protesting against Burma's entry. Fan Yu Teng is Pauline's father, and he's one of the best-known social activists for many years, her late father. He had assembled a group of people, I think 7 or 10 of them, to protest the entry of Myanmar into ASEAN. Well, it wasn't a small protest because it resonated very big in the financial capitals of the world, in particular in London, because it provoked George Soros to turn to Southeast Asia and say, I'm going to teach you a lesson, which of course resulted eventually in the Asian financial crisis. So a lot of autonomization. I haven't touched on KL yet, which I'm going to do. But it was a period of great change, a period of great restlessness. We had terms like, the end of history thrown in, as if the world history had already resolved itself and there seemed to be only one future and destiny for everybody else. That was very immediately, almost quickly thrown into the dustbin of history with an event that happened in Central Europe called the Balkanization of Yugoslavia, the breakup of Yugoslavia, where among other prominent voices was again Dr. Mahathir in his challenge to major powers, European powers and first world powers, to intervene in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where all this kind of slaughter and massacre was taking place. So that is the setting of Kuala Lumpur of the 1990s. Kuala Lumpur entered the 1990s after a very fractious period in the 1980s, which is why I like Boom Boom Bang's timeline, because it doesn't start in 1990, it starts in 1987. And 1987, of course, we understand to be the period of great restiveness and the consolidation, essentially, of what in the 1990s became what I call, what a friend of mine actually calls the Mahathir consensus. But for that consensus to be achieved, of course, there was a great of political rivalry. There was a lot of assault on institutions, a lot of compromise on institutions. There was, the judicial crisis. There was UMNO's internal crisis. There was crisis of personalities. That kind of settled in the 1990s around this consensus. And the consensus essentially was economic development. And I remember whenever younger people took rather oppositionary views on things, we'd be told by more elderly people who had been through things like Operasi Lalang. Operasi Lalang was when opposition members were rounded up and arrested in 1987. We were told, don't rock the boat, if we're on a good cause. And that essentially was what I think the Mahathir consensus was about. Basically to raise the nation up to certain economic foundations from which then other more liberal things could flow, including in the arts and so on. But it gave a lot of dynamism to the 1990s. The 80s were already very, very interesting. I grew up in the 80s. I came to age in the 1990s, but I grew up in the 1980s, a very, very interesting time. In the 1980s, I read a book by a wonderful Malay poet called Tengku alias Taib, and the book was called Pemburu Kota, the City Hunter. And that is what I became. I was born to very liberal parents who gave me a lot of room to be very delinquent. So I hunted Kuala Lumpur. Kuala Lumpur is a wild and mad place, and especially in the 1980s. One of the very interesting things about Kuala Lumpur that I always think about is that it was never meant to be a capital city. In fact, it was never meant to be a city, and it was never meant to be built on, because it's perhaps built on one of the most dangerous earth foundations in the world. Limestone, shifting limestone, and alluvial matter. So today when we get sinkholes in Jalan Masjid India, we should blame the authorities because they are a bunch of lazy brigands who's got their priorities elsewhere. I'm quite kind, I think, on our government, but I really hate our local authorities. And one of these days, as I promised my mother and everybody else, I don't ever want to run for political office. But if one day this government has balls enough to introduce mayoral elections, I'm standing. So I'm giving you all, kind of a lot of advance notice. Yeah, so it was not meant to be a capital city. It was started out as a tin mining area, built not on two rivers, on the convergence of two rivers, but on the convergence of three rivers, on the confluence of three rivers. One river has since disappeared, although it did exist in my lifetime. It was called Sungai Damansara, which ran through the university, yeah, and met up with the other two bigger, Sungai Gombak and Sungai Klang. And Kuala Lumpur started out as essentially a tin mining depot with a large Chinese working population and a large tin mining owner population that was largely Malay. It's quite interesting. We have, sometimes our history gets so perverted and a lot of wealth is attributed to the Chinese due to tin mining, except people always don't seem to remember that the workers were Chinese, but the owners of a lot of these things were Malay. So who was Abdullah Hukum? Abdullah Hukum was a tin merchant. Nga Ibrahim from Perak. Nga Ibrahim is represented by the Chinese in our Datuk Kong. You know Datuk Kong, those little red altars that you find with a figure in it? The figure in there is Nga Ibrahim, who was a big tin merchant and who was the godfather of most of the secret societies, the triads here. And then you had Raja Abdullah, who was also a major tin merchant, who basically commanded the riverway between Klang and Gombak. So that's what it started out as, and the British eventually, slowly seeing it as a center for commercial development, slowly made it an administrative center. And Kuala Lumpur, in its gentrified sense, began basically at the Spotted Dog, or what we know as Selangor Club, and Sultan Abdul Samad buildings, which had a great significance, of course, in the 1990s, when we were all marching there at the period of Reformasi. That's where I think Anwar eventually ended up. Rubin will remember. He had to hide as he went into the rally because TV3 couldn't catch him, you see. He cannot be seen in the rally. So yes, by the 1990s, Kuala Lumpur, which was never meant to be a capital city. In fact, when Malaya was independent, Ipoh was actually suggested to be a capital city, and Malacca was also suggested to be the capital city, but Kuala Lumpur had already been the administrative city. By 1990, it had served 100 years of Kuala Lumpur being the administrative city. But it was the center point, of course, of so much of what happened in the 1990s, beginning with the pronouncement of Wawasan 2020, the projection of building the KLCC Twin Towers. So today, if we understand why our principal administrative city, Putrajaya, is kind of a wasteland. Nobody wants to go there, and once you go there, you never know how to come out because it has all, about 15 of the biggest roundabouts in the world, and you just get lost. It's because a lot of concentration was put into KL to develop it essentially as the commercial city and center, at that time to rival even Singapore. That was one of our plans. But these were great plans of the 1990s. Now, because there was a lot of money. There was a lot of money in Malaysia, and there was a lot of money in Kuala Lumpur. As a star journalist, Sharad, you never had the Star, you had the Sun, right? Okay, as a star journalist, I earned double salary for 3 years in a row. 1994, 95, 96. Because the Star was the largest circulating paper. It also brought in so much advertising revenue that I had 1 year's bonus for 3 years running. What happened to it all? I drank it. I don't drink anymore, but I drank it then. But nevertheless, we were not an Asian tiger, and we were not one of the one of the new industrialized economies. We were on the threshold, but we were not actually one of those. One of the great ironies is that because we were not an Asian tiger, and because we were not a new industrialized economy, we didn't suffer as much during the Asian financial crisis, I think, if that's right. Of course, there were other measures we took, like the capital controls and things like that. But we were kind of interim, in between, and that kind of shielded us a little from really getting hammered like South Korea or Taiwan. So, what was the 90s like? Have I got time? 10 minutes or so? What symbolized the shift in the 1990s? Among journalistic circles, it was the sartorial evolution of Anwar Ibrahim. From black slacks and white sleeveless, short sleeve shirts to wearing Gucci suits. That was the great transformation. The introduction of this notion of the Melayu Baru, as to be compared to the Melayu Lama, which resonated with all the values of UMNO Baru, new UMNO as compared to old UMNO. And if you go back and you look at the political rhetoric of that time, so much of the Mahathir Anwar UMNO Baru trajectory was to look at the rival party, Semangat 46, Semangat 46, which was a breakaway from UMNO and led by Tengku Razali. And they apparently represented all UMNO. And there was a lot of parodying and a lot of being very sardonic about what old UMNO represented. Kind of tired old men, tired old values, not in time with, technological development, still largely rural or semi-rural, while UMNO itself now represented in Gucci suits by the Deputy Prime Minister, who talked about, renaissances, and who talked about literature and about the opening up of Malaysian society to more liberal ideas, democracy, and so on. I think this was the trend that was being set out in the 1990s. And that led, again, to what I thought is, what I've always thought, is the breakdown of the consensus about what the nation state was. So the nation died in Kuala Lumpur and gave way to a whole variety of variegated responses to what the nation might be. There was a lot of essentially self-searching, I think, that has continued to this day. Mahan is here. And, it's efforts like that of trying to break away from what has been formal and official histories, to find vernacular histories, to find different forms of expression, and which, very ironically, sometimes it can be very troublesome, but what the first lines of Boom Boom Bang exhibition statement says, it is the emerging of a more confident and more autonomous Malaysia. And we may think our society is very fractious and very troubled, and we have no stability. Well, stability comes with authoritarian trends. Stability, the lack of stability is what you pay for through a process of democratization. And Malaysia is maturing and maturing fast. And what we are going through is a process of democratization. So if you want stability, then you go back to the old Mahathir consensus, essentially of not necessarily authoritarian rule, but strong, firm vision of what there is. I have always been quite averse to the term dictator used on Mahathir. A dictator is Saddam Hussein. A dictator is even Lee Kuan Yew. What I've always tried to understand is, of the Mahathir consensus, is essentially how things are played off one another, how things are navigated, how much power is to be used, sometimes quite brutally, sometimes quite firmly, but it's the push and traction that has always interested me about this system and about that particular Prime Minister in terms of how complex and complicated his character is. But the 1990s also was commercial, I think economic economic consolidation gives birth to things that are beyond the state's control. And it was, everything starts to autonomize. We sit in an art gallery, and in the prior to the 1990s, the arts, for example, visual arts in particular, was pretty much guided by a certain elite and a certain institution, the Balai Seni Lukis Negara, that paid you enough but made you very dependent. It's quite interesting that many of the artists of great prominence, Ismail Zain, Syed Ahmad Jamal, were all government employees, including Piadasa. The one who decided that he's not going to be that way was Ibrahim Hussein and Latif Mohidin, and they sought their futures elsewhere, made connections on their own, developed commercial kind of vocation for themselves that was later emulated in the 1990s. But in the 1990s, the development of the art market, for example, was hugely interesting. Galleries were opening everywhere. And this was, of course, a reflection of a new elite as well. Old art-loving elite were people like Unku Aziz, people like Zain Azahari, a very small group, essentially, who bought up all the art of that time. But now you had people who, a democratization of the art market, and anybody with money could basically enter that market. The arts also started to proliferate. I remember the Instant Cafe Theatre getting its first 100,000 sponsorship to have a festival that was held in Carcosa at that time. I also remember, I can't remember which group it was, but also got 100,000 ringgit to do perhaps the worst production Malaysia has ever seen, a version of Macbeth. Can't remember who the director was, but I remember that Jo Kukatas played the main role. Bless her, I love her, she's my very dear friend. But we in the Star called her the Anchor Beer Lady, because she was dressed in red. And there's also the Skin trilogy, which has a compartment of its own there. A very long, laborious play, I'm afraid, that in my review I called worse than a circumcision. So much autonomy. I took on the role of cultural critic at that time for about 6 years. With great regret, I say I retired quite a few careers, wrote some very nasty lines, and remember a play that was put up by the Actors Studio, a 19th century Australian play. Can you remember? Imagine Malaysian actors dressed up in 19th century Australian costume. It was the worst things I'd bloody seen, called Big River or something. And so I reviewed the toilets in Dataran Merdeka underneath and had 2 or 3 lines. I remember another playwright coming, you know, that he had been lauded as a great playwright who wrote a play called Trees. God-awful thing, it was terrible. It was like drag, bad drag, you know. And we had a lot of space in the press in those days, and so I was invited for the preview and wrote a 1-page review calling the play a play in drag and whatever not. And I remember the last line was, timber. And nobody went to see the play. But a lot of money. Money was just a lot of funding for this, funding for that. None of which was really organized to really create something. So you had a lot of sponsorship, that was based on friendship, and very funny because we, blame the political system for being very nepotistic, but essentially we gained our money that way also, through friends that liked us, we entertained them and so on. But there was a lot of quality and searching too. I think that came out in the arts. So there were plays. Rahel wrote one. I remember that was very powerful. Performed at the British Council. So there was a lot of that, what I call very deep searching. But it all came to bust, I think, with 1997, and the Asian financial crisis. I think what the Asian financial crisis actually taught us, and if we look back at it, and if we look at the mess that Kuala Lumpur is in today, I think it taught us that while we had lots of vision, pulling the system up with that vision was not as easy as we thought. And in 1997, as Southeast Asia itself started to fracture following the Asian financial crisis, an event I covered, and in some places it was really dire. In Bangkok, people were throwing themselves off buildings. And I remember this very moving thing that I read in that time a magazine called the Far Eastern Economic Review. And one of the sad things about Southeast Asia is we no longer have journals or magazines of that kind that pull us all together. We have the Nikkei, but it's, we had Asia Week and the Far Eastern Economic Review at that time. And it's a very moving story about a businessman who lost all his money in the Asian financial crisis. And his ritual every day was to perform Death of a Salesman, Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, translated by himself into Thai. And he would perform it every day outside the bank to whom he owed money. Marvelous stories of this, very moving stories of this kind. But like Kuala Lumpur, so much of the wealth had been built on shifting sands. In Indonesia, that was very clear by the time Suharto fell, that essentially he had just been surrounded by an oligarchy of people. Malaysia was certainly nowhere as bad, but for all the wealth that was concentrated in this new wave of entrepreneurs and so on, there was neither real discipline or real transformation of the system to make that kind of wealth count. It's something we are still grappling with today. I'm taking my mum to Sri Lanka, and I was asked, when was the last time you had a family holiday, a real family holiday? And I said, maybe last time was Sri Lanka too, huh? When we all went as a family. But in 1996, my whole family went to New York. We went to New York, and you know what the ringgit was to the dollar then? 2.3. 2.3, I remember. And I remember my father beaming with, my father is an old school patriot, he gets very caught up with all this kind of thing. And we were on a tour on a New York bus, and we went past the Empire State Building, and the tour guide was talking about how Empire State Building was one time the tallest building in the world, and it's since been overtaken by Chicago, and we are waiting for the next tallest building in the world, which is in Malaysia, and it's the Petronas KLCC Twin Towers. And I remember my father just beaming with pride, right, as we were calling it indulgence, and things like that. But yeah, that was Kuala Lumpur of the 90s. What strikes me about Kuala Lumpur of the 90s and what really influenced things was really the cultural dimension. There were things that were very radical, and they're being shown up there too. Television became more authentic. Things like Jangan Ketawa, and then we had Pimai Tang Tu, the search for indigeneity. And I remember once coming back in 1991 And when you, of course, when you go and study overseas, the one thing you want to become is very authentic. And then you kind of discover that you know very little, being a middle-class Bangsa child. Your Malay is very formal, so you start relearning Malay, which was very easy to do in 1990 because of one marvelous book. That book was called Matsom, and it was written by our national laureate, national artist Lat. It brought me back to the Malay language. It brought me back to studying Malay poets, Latif Mohidin, Tengku alias Taib, and it brought a consensus, it brought a confluence with an aspect of cultural life that had been so formalized for me. Malay and the Malay language and the Malay experience had been formalized in a kind of national cultural policy, national education system institution. And we never had access to it. But in the 90s, that broke down. I think that broke down, and if you were interested enough, keen enough. The other great cultural phenomenon that brought us all together was an album called Hijau. And it was the first time an album was really brought up to all kinds of new marketing and commercial realms. And I remember being so awed and inspired when I was waiting for a bus. I used to take a bus sometimes those days. Take a bus to go to the newly opened Lot 10, a mall. And when the Srijaya bus stopped, for the very first time, we didn't have Dutch Lady or we didn't have Milo being advertised, but we had this cool, trendy album called Hijau on the Srijaya bus. And the first thing I did was buy about 20 cassettes of Hijau and take it back and give it to friends, who had never heard a sound like this. But a great thing about Hijau that really struck me was that along midway through the song in the bridge was the Kelantanese dialect. Yeah. And I became so fixated with the Kelantanese dialect that I became fixated on Kelantan. And in 1992, when I became a journalist, the past government gave me every reason to be even more fixated with Kelantan by banning every single good thing they had in their culture. So that was 1990s. It was, I think, a time of a lot of openness. It was a time of transition, so that connectivity was not as easy as it is today. So you still had that dimension where you had to look for what you wanted to look for. But it was there. It was, of course, easier. There was a lot more searching that resulted in a lot of what is actually shown today, and a lot of what people do. What were the bloody railway tracks? Okay, what was the riverine? A lot of independent efforts at trying to glean. The central state also started to break down, and lots more efforts from various phases. Yeah, women's interests, cultural interests. A lot of room was forced open during the 1990s. Cultural space, artistic space. You will also see Artist Proactive, which was formed in 1998. And of course, all this came into culmination or implosion, depends on which way you look at it, with the events of 1998 and Reformasi, when a lot of people chose to grapple with that issue on a partisan basis. On the partisan basis of, are you for Dr. Mahathir or are you for Anwar Ibrahim? Some decided to look at it and ask very fundamental and deep questions about who we are as a nation, who we are as, more important than a nation, who we are as a people. What does living as a very diverse community is? What does it mean? Ask very, very fundamental questions about the nature of our history, where we come from, and break down all those formal barriers formal constructions that had guided the nation for that long. Many of the players who were directly involved in Reformasi don't seem to realize that they are also today living in what is the post-Reformasi phenomenon. Because once you unleash those questions, the search has a life of its own. And I think no person, I think the one person that is most unaware of this is the person who unleashed Reformasi in the first place. That he is now living in a post-Reformasi situation, context, and that questions are far beyond that of his freedom or not. Where does Kuala Lumpur then rest today? In a very difficult place. I think Kuala Lumpur is a very depressed society, very depressed city. It's very undecided about what it is and what it can be. We have authorities who don't let it be what it should be. Kuala Lumpur is interesting even in how it is arranged. So you have, as I said, an administrative capital, even back then. And then you had the commercial zone, from which so much of the life of Kuala Lumpur was born, right? Everything from small businesses, different communities living next to one another. I ask people, why is Chinatown called Chinatown? And the response to me is, because there are a lot of Chinese people there. Actually, there are lots of other people there also. But it's called Chinatown because it's the area in which most of the Chinese communities decided to establish their clan houses and and it's also very interesting because it's called Chinatown as a collective among very disparate Chinese communities. Teochew Association, Hakka Association, Hokkien Association. All this is hardly ever known. And we are arriving at a place where these things are now in kind of in balance, and a lot that is actually propping up and keeping this community consciousness is the work of the people on the ground. Whereas in terms of commercial, corporate, and government interests, it's all about plonking Merdeka 111 right at the center of essentially a community. It's quite interesting that a lot of Merdeka 118 locates itself in this idea of community, new community, emerging out of community, except the entire community around that really hates that building. And then we have a more administrative approach of basically gentrifying Kuala Lumpur, not allowing it to breathe its own life, and to bring copycat plans and things from mostly European countries. This is what we should do in Pudu. This is what they did in Brooklyn, right? They're writing about this in the pages of The Edge and so on. Just nonsense. But there is very little effort to really go to the ground and find out what Kuala Lumpur, how organic Kuala Lumpur not only functions today but has always functioned. Sometimes people ask me what. Sorry. Sorry. I was listening to Keluar Sekejap, and now it's come on on its own. I've always known these guys to be, demons of some kind. So that's the challenge of Kuala Lumpur. Kuala Lumpur has always been an organic city. I think that has been decided by, of its contours as to what it wants to be by its own people, and so it ranges everything from cricket matches to opium dens and red light areas and BB Park. But today there is just too much, I think, intervention by policymakers into what Kuala Lumpur should be. A couple of months ago, we had, about a year ago now, we had a dear friend of ours who's a very well-known writer, very deeply respected, whose name is Jeff Dyer. And Jeff Dyer came for the Georgetown, and this I think is the indictment for Kuala Lumpur, which I think we should actually pay a lot of attention to if we want it to become the city that it is. cosmopolitan, polyglot, very wild, quite mad, with boundaries of its that it decides on its own. And Jeff Dyer came for the Georgetown Literary Festival, and and I said, Jeff, if you're going to be in Penang, you should come down to KL and do something. And he said, okay, and we had a real fine time doing the session, and he was due to stay for 3 days. We put him in the Four Seasons in Petaling Street in Chinatown. Jeff Dyer stayed for 1 month in a Kuala Lumpur that he found vibrant and irresistible. By the end of it, don't tell him this, but we were, Pauline and I was telling Pauline, I'm bugger going to leave, man, you know. Finally, Christmas forced him to go back. We miss Jeff, we should. But he left, you know, and this is a man who observes cities. I mean, he's written about them beautifully and evocatively. And I think he finds KL one of the most irresistible cities. And the experiences were, you know, but because it had a life of its own. And practically it was, on the whole, pretty safe and fashionable and stylish. I've never seen hijabis so beautifully dressed in Doc Martens boots and hanging out till 4 a.m. in the morning in Chinatown. What a great advertisement for Islam, was one of the things he said. Now, we, of course, don't allow that to happen because we do need, we always find these DBKL people coming here. God, I really hate them. I keep repeating it. But yeah, KL has no plan for itself. And here's my thing, which I think I learned from the 1990s in Kuala Lumpur, which even as it was the era and the decade of land grab, of the worst kind of accesses, it was also a period of autonomy and people able to find places of their own, set up things that they wanted, everything from Central Market to Pudu to Bukit Bintang, really had a life of its own. And that is what a city is, I suppose, in the end. The insistence of its people to decide what it wants the city to be. I think there was a lot of the 90s that we enjoyed through that. Sometimes people ask me, what does KL need so that it continues to be as exciting and vibrant? And my response is always, it needs vice. If it doesn't have vice, it's going to be a Puritan city. And that's one of the things we have to negotiate and work out all the time. But I'll end by talking about the fact that I am a native Kuala Lumpurian. And I come from a place, Bangsa, which I think encapsulates the Kuala Lumpur experience. When we first moved in 1971, we learned how to catch snakes because there were cobras everywhere as they were clearing the jungle. And people who lived in Ampang, you know, considered themselves very elite and were laughing at my parents for buying a house in the Pontianak area, rubber estate called Bung, whatever, you know, 2 Belgian guys. And it started out as a place for lower middle class government servants who, and in the 1980s, it grew into this amazing commercial area and then eventually became the fashionable area. Because in the 1980s, Bangsa was not yet the commercial area. It was a place where you had food stalls. Do you remember? They had food stalls that people would go to eat after they come from KL or Bukit Bintang. And suddenly it developed by the 1990s into this incredible row of streets of bars and tapas houses and so on. Today, I'm afraid it's a place for gangsters driving Ferraris. That's another story about where Kuala Lumpur is going, black money and the black economy, which is very prominent in Bangsa. So I think us of this generation, born in 69, born in 70, became the first indigenized Kuala Lumpurians, native Kuala Lumpurians, have seen that kind of evolution and today wonder where Kuala Lumpur is going to go. But boom and bust. But Kuala Lumpur, I think always, there's a survival mode to Kuala Lumpur that just never goes away, okay? And there's so many other significant things that I wish sometime we think about. One of the greatest shifts in the Kuala Lumpur character is St. John's Church. St. John's Church. Because St. John's Church today is a Filipino church. And that is one of the great marks of the commercial development of Kuala Lumpur. That by the late 80s and by the 90s, you know, the Filipino domestic helper essentially changed the face of Kuala Lumpur also, St. John's Church, Kota Raya. And these are mappings and markings I hope that we'll be able to look at and do, and a lot of it actually is being shown. But I stay in Bangsa, and I have a workplace in Federal Hill, that is by the last jungle reserve in Kuala Lumpur. We had a landslide recently because that jungle reserve is also being intruded upon, and I think a royal is building their big palace there, so you know the sand all fell into my apartment. But it's a beautiful place to contemplate Kuala Lumpur, because you get a good sight, and when the lights of Kuala Lumpur come together from Federal Hill, there is this very nice gauze that is created. Very, very evocative. And maybe I end with a line from one of my favorite books. It's a book called Invisible Cities by the great Italian writer Calvino. And I think about these lines often as I stand on Federal Hill and look. Cities light as kites appear, pierced cities like laces, cities transparent as mosquito nettings, cities life leaves veins, cities lined like a hand's palm, filigree cities to be seen through their opaque and fictitious thickness. That is something that I think Kuala Lumpur is all about, and something I contemplate as to, you know, what is going to be, even as my area changes with further kind of apartment blocks built and roads not. So city life involves so many things: the life of its people, the light, and a lot of, you know, where does planning and where does management play a role in the organic nature of the city. So I'll stop now, and anyone who wants to ask discussion, I've got time for discussion or question, can do so. Thank you. Who commands this question? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, EDDIN. We have time now for a short Q&A. So if anybody would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and a mic will be handed to you.
Well-listened education as always. Thank you, sir. Wanted to understand from the prism of how varied is it from Singapore?
Sorry?
How varied is it from Singapore? The 1990s experience, and where did the trajectories diverge in terms of cultural politics, in terms of how whether Singapore brands itself as a very, very international global space, often not from the region, and how this city kind of negotiates its space vis-a-vis the region as well as its politics.
I'll take a few, then we can address. Anyone else? Oh, right at the back.
Hello, hi. Iwanina, research officer. In what ways, I have a certain opinion towards how I believe we are getting Malaysian ourselves, we're getting polarized more than ever today. My question is, in what ways has cultural identity been used to deepen or resolve political divides in history?
Very big question. Okay, just one more and then I will answer the three. Anyone?
Hello. Hello. So from what I remember as a child growing up in the 1990s, the television drama at that time, especially RTM, was monopolized by one particular company, HVD, which brought many directors from Hong Kong and all that. And there was also one time that the government want to privatize finance to HVD, which fortunately been cancelled. So what, as a cultural critic, what is your opinion about what the atmosphere about that time was there any directors or scriptwriters, local scriptwriters and directors that are not satisfied with this arrangement and yeah, all that. So thank you.
I'm not sure actually what you're referring to, but never mind, I'll come back to you and ask you a few questions. The first, Singapore and Malaysia. Now, that's a very, one of my frustrations actually about many of these experiences, the 90s and so on, and that's so excited about this exhibition upstairs, is that so little is written about it in a cultural and literary way. We have so much about the 90s and so on. It's all damn academic stuff. And it's just full of orthodoxies. Scholarship is fine, but academia, is another wart altogether. And there just doesn't seem to be enough of a creative approach to how to write about all these things, when there's so much actually by way of memoir, recollection, that we can remember, right? In the 80s, the Sudirman concert itself was phenomenal. It's such a phenomenon. The presence of a minister like Shahriz Samad was also very inspiring. I got my break, into the arts. Before that, I was terrible. I was a delinquent, and I was fighting with people all the time, and brawling and things like that. But there was this minister, and he was cool, and he wore funny, outlandish ties, and he smoked cigarettes, and he was in all the arts events. He ran for marathons and things like that. But inspirational, right? But there he was opening, and he called people. We had our first Kuala Lumpur Arts Festival in 1986. It was a very modest arts festival, a very, very good one. Which included others, groups from the Philippines, PETA, and people like that. And he was at the center of it, and he called for volunteers. I was in my SPM year that year, and I was failing all my subjects. I asked my mother whether I could be a volunteer, and of course she berated me because I was getting terrible grades. Finally I told her I'll ask my father. This is my interesting family dynamic. It's quite a Kuala Lumpur story as well, so I'm going to tell it to you. And so, my mother very strict, my father kind of very liberal and open. And so I told my mother, okay, never mind, I'll ask Papa. And she gave me a glare. And I remember us at the dining table, sitting in the square dining table. And then I said, Pa. And then she gave me a glare. And I said, do you know Shahriz Samad? He said, yeah, he was a student in UM, but I don't really know him. I said, he's calling for volunteers for this Kuala Lumpur Arts Festival. And here I was, quite a delinquent student, getting, suspended for going to Arafat and all that kind of thing. And my father looked at me and he said, oh, that's very good. And then my mother gave him a glare and said, and then my father looked at me and said, looked at my mother and said, no, it'll be good for him, he'll get him to have focus and center and whatever not, even though then my mother said his SPM is in October, he's failing on his, and my father's response was wonderful. Never mind, he can repeat next year. A lot of this not encapsulated. Well, the question about Singapore is interesting. The question about what makes Singapore different from Malaysia is political style. It's the style of leadership. I had one encounter with Lee Kuan Yew. And Lee Kuan Yew is a scary man. Scary, scary man. Scary in terms of, I've never seen a leader and who's been able to combine the intelligence and the intellect of a hard professor with the kind of brutality and pugnaciousness of a triad leader that he killed. Right? I've never met a person who's been able to. The man's a kind of very silent butcher. And I remember interviewing J.B. Jeyaretnam, Joshua Jeyaretnam, who was long-time opposition leader in Singapore. I interviewed him here in KL with his, mutton chop sideburns. And J.B. Jeyaretnam, of course, was really a victim of Lee Kuan Yew, if you could ever find one. Man didn't even have the shirt on his back, by the time he died. And 2 successful sons, who somehow never. And he lived in a rented room in Johor Bahru. That's where he died. But he posed a very interesting question to me when I asked him. I said, we talked about democracy. And he said, Lee Kuan Yew is not undemocratic. This is coming from J.B. Jeyaretnam. Lee Kuan Yew is not undemocratic. Because he's put a choice to the people. Democracy is my kind of democracy, which is liberal ideas, civil society. That's one democracy. The other democracy is Lee Kuan Yew's democracy. Efficiency, punctuality, everything functions. The people have made their choice. Right? They sympathize with me, but their head is all with Lee Kuan Yew. So political style, I think, defined that a lot. And Singapore is a lot smaller. Malaysia is just, Malaysia is small in size, very big in terms of its composition. And of course, the way we have chosen to shape our political system. A lot of people think it's, preferential this and all that. No, but I urge you all to go back and look at the kinds of discussions that were being held when we decided on the kind of very distinctive political system that we actually created. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of consensus, a lot of give and take. Otherwise, as I always say, we would have become a revolutionary society, right? And revolutionary societies suffer. Ours was one based on consensus. As much as we like to, and many Malaysians, I myself am one of them, who tend to romanticize revolutions. But we know what happened with Sukarno, okay? And we know what happened in many other societies that had this kind of revolutionary impulse. Whereas ours has been a give and take, consensus building, a lot of discussion, a lot of friendships. It also has its weaker side, which is a lot of what is very crucial was decided on a very gentleman basis, And my father used to say this actually all the time, Tunku would just get all his friends together and then they decide what they want for the communities. And by 1969, that ruptured, because nothing was actually, kind of consolidated, put down. And there was no intellectual evolution of what were very critical questions. For example, how do races get together? What are religious rights? I remember interviewing a leader who is now in Amanah, but he used to be in PAS. Okay? And he spoke to us about, about how Islam, it is incumbent upon Muslims. It was a very poignant way of expressing this, about how Islam deals with non-Muslim rights. Okay? And as I said, it was poignant, and he talked a lot about innate justice in Islam, especially when it comes to non-Muslims and how we have to look after and protect. So moving, I suppose quite sentimental. But I posed the question to him, and he kind of fell off his chair. I said, that's all well and good. Nobody refutes this or denies this about Islam. But we live under a constitution, not a covenant. And he was didn't know how to respond. Because many of these questions were not, rigorously, intellectually worked out, I think, which comes to your question about racial polarization and communal polarization, religious polarization. There's a lot of polarization, apparently. I don't deny, but I also don't think it's as bad as people think. One of the things that is really frustrating me increasingly, as more and more people get a voice, more and more people can, do a keluar sekejap. More and more people can go and do their podcasts every day. And what is frustrating me about Malaysia is that everybody has some legitimacy in what they say, and then a lot of nonsense in how they describe things. So I'm also very, very shocked. I'm very dismayed. One of the things I think we suffer a lot from is creating a language that reflects our own contradictions and difficulties. I don't like the term apartheid being used in Malaysia. I really hate it. It is very disrespectful to people who really lived under apartheid. Okay? I was at a dinner party last year. Very wealthy lawyer, Indian, living in Damansara Heights on the hill. 2 Porsches, 1 Audi, 1 BMW, 1 Mercedes. Dinner, very boring dinner, in which everybody talks about how they were such victims of everybody else. Yeah. And holding his whiskey and, damning indictment of the country, looking down and saying, apartheid. Apartheid was the color of your skin and the fact that you had to live 60 to 80 kilometers away while you commuted every day, and where you shat in the drains because you had no sewage and sanitation, because you were of that color. 2 Porsches, 1 Audi, 1 Mercedes, 1 BMW, whiskey glass, looking at the rest, those who live below, those who live at the foot of the hill, and saying apartheid. Have we got problems? We've got huge problems. Our racial, religious things are so problematic. They're not even dangerous, they are quite perverse. Okay? But I think there's a lot that is happening that is of the post-Reformasi phenomenon. Questions that are unleashed about how people get together, how they have been. I think all those things, if kept alive, I think make for very significant discourse and dialogue that can bring about a lot more conversation between people, and I think it's actually happening. My fear always with how things like polarization have an effect on us is hijacking of system. Is the hijacking of the system. Okay, what is very interesting now as governments have changed, and everyone has promised reform. What is very interesting to me is, and this is innate to the political process and the players in the political process. Once you inherit the system, right, you realize how favorable it is to you. And so you never want to change it, right? You never want to change it. And I think that is inevitable among political players. It's happening everywhere in the world. And in fact, if you look at the world today, Malaysia got crisis, but really not that bad. Look at what's happening in France at the very moment. So I think there is polarization. I think there's all these things. I'm not downplaying it. The threat of religious people, all these kinds of things. But I think democratization is also taking its root. I'll give you a very, very interesting example. Dogs. I love them. I have 4 of them. Today, many people who run shelters, who run Facebook pages, Club Pencinta Anjing, okay, 135,000 followers, all Malay. All Malay. So there's a lot of kind of being in between things, being in between things, being fairly devout, but also being very open to these kinds of experiences. And I think what is very important in Malaysian and operating in Malaysian society and today is that everybody is really quite critical and critical of authority. Very, very critical of authority. So any kind of political party that today sits in great luxury and thinks, because I won this amount of seats, I'm very popular, I will be next, you're very sadly mistaken. And for all the lack of stability in our political system and process, I think that is the most advantageous thing to us. And that we need to rationalize it rather than bring back any kind of stability. Because if you bring back any kind of stability, there is going to be an authoritarian trend somewhere. Okay, people will also call the country Taliban. If we lived in a Taliban country, and I did the work I did with ritual people in Kelantan, I'd be dead. Okay, but here you can negotiate, and you constantly play. I'm not saying the legal aspects are not serious, are not even dangerous, but they certainly don't have the kind of will, authoritarian will, that many other societies have. So I think to be self-reflective is the most important thing. To know your history is the most important thing. And when you know your history, then you understand the contradictions. And the wonderful thing about Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur is always locate yourself in the contradictions. That's how it works. What's the last question? I don't know what's HBD, brother. What's HBD?
In the 1990s, the RTM Chinese drama and Malay drama was basically dominated by one single company called HBD Holdings. Yeah, so, and these HBD Holdings, they relied heavily on the expertise from Hong Kong to the directors and scriptwriters. So I'm wondering whether our local players in the entertainment industry at that time, were they grumbling about that or anything?
I have no idea. And I have very little access. I don't speak Chinese, so I have very little access to Chinese language stuff. But I was a big fan of Empat Sekawan. I don't know if you know that drama, Empat Sekawan. And they were big stars, and they happened to run the grocery store in Lucky Gardens as well. So you don't know it, Empat Sekawan. You know? You know. Fantastic they were. And then there was Man in the Net, Chow Yun Fat. But I don't know about the management and ownership of these kinds of things. But I know that our creative industry is in a rut, total rut. And we had a lot more, one of the things that I think was very animated in the 90s was the fact that we had a lot of open space for reviews, for critical inquiry into creative life. Today that is all gone. Yeah. One of the great laments that I have, of course, is the death of the newspaper, the death of traditional journalism, where you were required to have a certain amount of critical inquiry, that is elaborate, that is well considered. Today it's reduced to 132 letters or something, and a lot of scurrilous stuff and just shouting at each other. Anything else? Yes, Deva.
So hi. Thank you a lot for a really beautiful presentation and enlightening in many ways for us, for Matsale, living here. Well, I'm like that writer Jeff who came for a couple of days and then 10 years later I still don't want to leave. And ever since I came here, I felt very, very welcome. But what I tend not to do is to say to the people in the public where I come from. So I come from Serbia, and because of everything that happened in Bosnia, somehow I kept that information for myself. Unless in a Grab car I see plenty of Ganesh or Buddhas, then I can kind of say where I'm from. But beside that, I always felt welcome. So last week I was with a friend, and we were in a public, and she said very out loud, like, "Oh, this is my friend from Serbia." Then a couple of minutes later, I said, like, "Well, you know what? Maybe in future you don't really need to be that loud." And she's like, "Nola, majority of Malaysians have very short memory, both when it comes to social and political life. That is what keeps us together." So my question is, for someone who comes from Balkans, where people obviously have a very long memory and the country fall apart, ex-Yugoslavia, that made me think, like, is this, and I want to hear your feedback because of everything you said, is that part of the formula of staying together? I mean, having that short-term memory when it's needed, both when it comes to political life and when it comes to social interactions between different races and religions. Thank you.
Any other question? That's a very interesting situation. Because I think of it this way. What if someone today introduced themselves and said they are from Israel? Here. I think you would get a lot of engagement. Because one of the things I think that keeps Malaysian society very alive and keeps violence really at a bay is a sense of curiosity. We are really quite interested about other people, even our enemies, our perceived enemies. I don't think anybody who said they are from Israel today would get a real kind of hostility that is menacing, you know, the kind of hostility you get when you go into a working class white area in Newcastle and you're brown. You wouldn't get that, okay? You may get a bit of resentment and then, you know, engagement to have my side of the story, or Palestinian side of the story told. And then, so yeah, I think short-term memory, long-term memory operates at a certain level. But I think if you get on a level of engagement, being from Serbia, and us being, of course, you know, having housed Bosnian refugees and all that kind of thing, very involved, directly very involved. And Dr. Mahathir made many visits to Sarajevo. I think the thing you would find is that level of engagement. There would be maybe resentment and dislike of Serbians, maybe, but even then it will be expressed in levels of engagement. You see, I think we are able to keep our violence down to a minimal because innate to Malaysian society, I think Malaysian society, but you know, not even in Southeast Asia, other Southeast Asian places, it can be quite menacing. But Malaysia, I think, it's innate to the way we are and we have evolved. My concern sometimes is that when you lack a memory, essentially of how complicated you are, then your capacity for engagement and curiosity becomes less and less. It becomes insulated, you see. And then you respond in very Puritan ways. So that's always a prospect. I think it's very balanced in Malaysia, but at the moment I think we do operate on that level of engagement. It could start out a little hostile, maybe a little angry or something, but after a while I think you're able to get a dialogue. Having said that, you know, violence has happened in our society, but you never want it to go that way. I think there's always room, and we are just so bloody mixed. We're such a bastard culture. So we must always appeal to that to keep our sense of sanity. Yeah.
Can you say anything about the club scene?
The club scene.
In the 90s?
There's so much to talk about actually in the 90s. Huh? Yeah, I mean, with that, the club scene was big. I mean, you know, I have a friend, I won't mention. Sorry?
Ruben
I would know about it.
Yeah, Rubin. Why you, huh? You. I went a lot, Beetle Nut, Ladisla, all this. I went to the jump. Yeah, I went to Level LA. Of course. I didn't go with you, but I went. But now, yeah, Rubin was more of a clubber. I was more of a pubber, I think. I was more of a pubber. Yeah, I'll give you that. I wasn't a clubber, I was more of a pubber, but I did used to go. But, you know, one of the very interesting things, I told this to Anis yesterday, I think. I have a friend, I won't mention his name. I can't mention his name. He basically runs Bukit Bintang and Pudu. Runs. You know Runs? Okay. And he ran a club that was near Instant Cafe's theatre upstairs. If you go, so theatre upstairs, and then you go further in, there was a club. And he invited me one day. Very, very good friend, my brother, really my brother, protector and everything. This was about 1996, 97. And I went to this club, and I found that the club was full of really young people, like 15, 16, you know. And they were headbangers, like that, okay? And the music was that kind of, you know, club music. And I was invited to the special VIP place and having drinks and whatever not. Then I looked at the bar, at the menu. And I discovered that a bottle of water was more expensive than a whiskey. And this was the first time I was introduced to this thing called ecstasy. Ecstasy, okay? Which, of course, was huge in Kuala Lumpur in that time. So along with a clubbing scene was a lot of that. Ecstasy, sorry?
Feng Shao. That was the phenomenon. That was, yeah.
And cocaine, all around this area, the Shangri-La, you know, kind of area. And this is typical of any capital city, you know, very yuppie. That was the yuppie drug, very available. There was a dangdut club with Cik Ani, who was the dangdut singer. She was really something. But the club was just full of older men of power. Police, Bukit Aman, all this kind of thing, right? It was a very, very interesting network of... here we are talking about Kuala Lumpur, but one day we should have something on under, you know, Samizdat Kuala Lumpur, which was really, really very, very, very fascinating. Stories of basically triads, how business interests brought various triad groups together, you know, in advancement of business. Very recently, when the red shirts took to, you know, when the red shirts were marching, and they wanted to march through Chowkit, okay, and basically replay May 13th. And nobody knew that essentially the Chinese, Malay, Indonesian, and Indian groups in that area came together and said that if there were any kind of the red shirts, whom they see as politics, huh? If politics was to, they just block up they work together to block up and contain them, you see. And so the red shirts didn't venture there. So they're these very interesting sides of KL, which Singapore doesn't have. Although Singapore criminality is now like really on the rise, and that's a result, I think, really of repressed people. If you go and watch some of these things, there are a lot of peeping toms and things, weird kind of, you know, upskirt camera people and weird, very weird kind of psychosis that is going on there. But the levels of criminality in Singapore also a post-capitalist phenomenon, right? I was amazed. We went to Singapore I haven't traveled out of the country since COVID, so Singapore was my first. I was amazed at how you can smoke in illegal places these days. And I was amazed at the number of smokers in Singapore these days. So many people are smoking. So these are natural cycles, phenomenon. But I think deep down, KL, there's a lot of engagement, there's a lot of curiosity. And I think that has helped us kind of move ahead. And full of contradictions. Contradictions that are encapsulated in the hijabi who wears Doc Martens boots. Yeah. And I think KL is actually just very stylish. People have their own sense of style, and people have their own sense of... I think that does a lot in kind of consolidating independence and, you know, autonomous space. Yeah. Anyone else? I'm very tired, but we can have one more.
Any other questions? I think last question.
In your earlier, before you started your speech, you mentioned about M. Nasir, and one of the pictures here features Amy Search, Blay Rock album. what happened to our musicians? Where is the research today and the MNASE today? We keep on speaking about the previous past, and you are also in the music space as well.
Every aspect of Malaysian life needs to be really explored. Again, stuff has been written about music, but again, it's academic, and it's sour, and it's boring, and it has no life. Malay music in particular, developed evolution very interesting, because you had very independent commercial record companies that recorded a lot of the best of what I consider Malay music, cabaret music of the 1950s, 40s, 50s, okay? All this very independent. Even Asli, Keroncong those days, all done like this. Malay music died in the 70s, and the man who caused its death just died recently. And he's a paradox himself, because his name is Ahmad Nawab. Ahmad Nawab wrote one of the most beautiful Malay cabaret songs ever, called Bintang Malam, okay? Recorded by Zahara Agus, and then another version done by Saloma. Just flawless, just beautiful. And then he killed Malay music by introducing the synthesizer to every bloody thing, and horn arrangements and things like that. This was the 70s and the 80s. Okay? But by the 80s, you had new groups emerging, and styles, influencing independent music. Cabaret Tedang is upstairs. There, Joe Kidd and his gang in the 90s. But in the 80s, you had Rasta. And I was very privileged I caught the early search. And I caught the early Ella. This was in the 80s, 84, 85. I was very underage, just never mind about that. But there were clubs. It was a club scene. So club scene beyond the LA, Rubin's, kind of yuppie boom boom room thing. There were the other clubs, like Beer Keller in PJ Section 14. Beer Keller was where Ella performed when she was very young. She was 17 years old, 18 years old. And she was a rocker, Janis Joplin and everything, right? And then I saw Search when they first performed in Red Rooster in Taman Tun. And Red Rooster, liberal Malaysia. In 1986, 85, 86, Red Rooster was a chicken. They served chicken. They were a food place, actually. They served chicken. But then they had, after that, and they served beer in this restaurant, right? And you had all kinds of people come there and eat the food, even as they were serving beer. But they had happy hour from 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock. And you could get a jug of Anchor or Tiger, not Carlsberg, but Anchor or Tiger for 1 cent. For 1 cent, right? And there we would go in our school uniform and drink beer for 1 cent. And then that was over by 7 o'clock. And then Search would perform at 9 p.m. So we'd guzzle about maybe 10 jugs of beer between 5 to 7, and then buy one after 7 is over, that lasts us till about 12 midnight or something like that, okay? Because that beer was maybe 7.50 or something. But that's when I first saw Search. And Search was phenomenal because Amy was a postman, in JB. He was a post guy. And what I always find very interesting about people like Ella, Amy, Blues Gang, also my dear friends. And I remember Blues Gang had a drummer. His name was Karim, a big guy, big brawny guy, who couldn't speak any English, and he was very grumpy. Okay, very grumpy, and he couldn't speak any English. But when he goes on and he sings B.B. King, first time I got the blues. I'm like, where does this come from? Same with Ella and same with Amy. They just have this incredible take on the music. Eventually it evolved. But music's and two of our most innovative, of course. Many styles changed. Mnase being one of them, Ramli Sarip being the other, are from Singapore. Singaporean Malays, and there's just very interesting takes on our relations. So as you know, M. Nasir and Ramli Sarip came here in the 1970s. Of course, made Malay music what it is. M. Nasir is one of the great innovators, and Apokalips is named after a song by him. And Ramli Sarip's Sweet Charity and the famous concerts in the Lake Gardens, you know, they had this famous concert in the Lake Gardens. And I used to go, underage, of course. I was there at Sudirman's concert, had my first taste of gudang garams, because they'd sell them in Chowkit in those days, gudang garams on the, like this, right? They have a table open and then they sell. But the sense of camaraderie was really kind of marvelous when you went for those kinds of things. And I think by the 90s, in the 80s, we had a Puritan streak, a very Puritan streak. You might remember that the long hair of our kutus was cut on public television by Tok Mat, Muhammad Rahmat, immortalized by the Instant Cafe as Mat Bulat, okay? So a lot of these are things I think that just need to be put together. Last month we had Lat. We sat Lat down, you know, we had a conversation. I think one of the very marvelous things I think that Malaysia needs to do is just sometimes remember names as well. We remember names and then we remember periods, and the plurality of experience is, I think, very, very instructive of how we get along as people. Okay, it's very ironic that, you know, in the 1980s, the biggest Malay group was a bunch of Indian Afro guys called the Alley Cats. Okay, Indian Afro guys. I never liked their music, but that was what they were. So I think that's why I keep saying, and I think when I say the end of formal histories, the end of the idea of national history, not in the end that the system doesn't keep promoting it, you see, but the end because people just are not interested in it already. And then they look for histories in other kinds of places, which is why the work that we started to do in Kelantan was so informative, you see, because you really start to understand what the worldview of a people are, what other things inform history, right? How you use certain things that are very, very innate to us as societies, orality, for example. One of the most inspiring things my father ever said about history, he was asked once. He said, what is the first source of history? And without blinking, he said, gossip. Understand the gossip of that time. And so much that is great has been written out of gossip. Jane Austen, for example, is gossip. So it's autonomizing. It's not that formal histories are no longer important. It's not that approaching a national history is no longer important. But you allow as many diverse spaces to open up and engage, because it is that kind of composite that I think enlivens and animates this. Can you write a formal history of Kuala Lumpur? You cannot. You know, your formal history of Kuala Lumpur will be very messy. You cannot write a history of Kuala Lumpur without talking about opium. You cannot write a formal history without talking about prostitution. You cannot write a formal history of Kuala Lumpur without talking about Rose Chan, right? Whose principal customer was Tunku Abdul Rahman. Yeah, every time Rose Chan performed, he would go. And he was not shy about it. So why in hindsight are we very shy about it? Right? One of the visitors to my house, and I'll conclude with this, very nice memory. One of the visitors to my house in the 70s was a very well-dressed Malay gentleman. Okay, spoke very fine English, white-haired, and smoked cigarettes. And later I found out he was one of the Malay language's great and most formative and formative writers. And one of the Malay left's great nationalists. But you never know that, because he was always dressed ready to go to the cabaret where we would drop him in Pertama Complex. His name was Ishak Haji Muhammad, Pak Sako. Remember, man? He used to come to the house all the time. And when he received his citation, my father gave the citation for his honorary doctorate. Yeah? Even up till the 90s, I mean, things like, in the Star, I was the principal correspondent for Islamic affairs. It was me. So when, for example, IKIM was set up, established, I did the interview with Ahmad Sarji. Yeah? 4 pages or 5 pages. I was the principal reviewer of Islamic books. Today that is not allowed. You can't get a non-Muslim, however well educated and versed in Islam, to write a book review on Islam, let alone conduct an interview or a comment piece. Right? And always remember that for the years that I was in journalism, I was the Kelantan correspondent, de facto lah. Because every past leader would give me an interview, you see, and I could get a lot of stuff. You don't get that today. So where the polarization becomes worrying is that if these non-issues, Muslim writing on Islam, all this kind of thing, they get seeped into and entrenched into the system, then the system just has a life of its own, you see. And that's what I fear is becoming, that you have formal settings in which people aren't able to make these convergences. Okay, I'm very tired. Thank you so much.